Our final speaker before lunch is Allan Hamilton, is a true polymath, a professor of neurosurgery, professor of radiation oncology, director of the Arizona Simulation Technology and Education Center, a horse whisperer, a consultant to Gray's Anatomy. And his topic is mystery of memory. It's going to be a personal perspective from the cellular to the corporate. Allan.
All right, so when Mark gave me this talk subject, he said, I'd like you to talk about memory. And I said to him, well, could I talk to you a little bit about it? And after I talked for him about 45 minutes, it was like I had dropped acid. And I said, you know, I got to go back and think about this for a while. And I started doing a lot of research, and I disappear into my study and start working on some research papers related to this. And after a while, my wife would know, hey, if I disappeared in the evening. And one night she said to me, are you going to work on that talk for MI6? And, you know, I sort of said, oh, you know, we'll have to change the name here a little bit. Let me see if I can get it. So I am giving this talk as MI6, and because I've been here 3 times, so I figured MI2 times 3. But I do want to warn you that we need to remain seated for the rest of this briefing. Because it is MI6, we're going to be watching every single one of you very carefully. So that said, let me talk a little bit about the objectives. And the first is, you know, what do we know about memory? How does it affect us as individuals? And what does it tell us about institutional memory? So you'll see a lot of the themes that the other speakers had talked about. I'm going to kind of count on you to use that knowledge. I want to talk first about this gentleman. This is a guy named Clive Wearing, who was a very gifted musician, composer, and a musical director for the BBC. And at age 47, he developed herpes encephalitis in 1985. And after this bout of herpes encephalitis, that was really the last memory he made. Herpes encephalitis is an inflammation which attacks, I don't know if I can show you this, it attacks these red parts, which are the hippocampus, primarily the temporal lobes, but in particular it can be very savage in terms of the temporal lobes. And after that, it was the last new memory he made. I want to give you some idea of what this actually represents in human terms. This is his diary. And if you look at it, he says, now I am really, then he crosses it out, says, almost perfectly awake, first time. But he reads the sentence above, and he goes, oh, so he puts an arrow. And then he goes, now I am almost completely perfectly awake, first time, and then goes back. So there are hundreds and hundreds of pages in these journals, all the same. It's this human being who is in the moment of awakening. And it became quite difficult. When he was struck down with herpes encephalitis, his children were very small. So as they grew up and became adults, he no longer recognized them. In fact, the only person he recognizes is his wife. But he notices that his wife appears older. And you'll see in this video clip I'm going to show you, I want you to see how effusive his greeting is, as if they have been separated for years. So let me just see if I can get this going for you.
One man is consigned to live entirely within the present, with terrible consequences. Clive Wearing has the worst case of amnesia ever known. 20 years ago, he lost his memory, and now his wife, Deborah, is the only person he recognizes.
Clive really only has less than 30 seconds memory. And sometimes it's as little as perhaps 7 seconds. It's as little as a sentence.
I'm going to see your sister, Adele. Her daughter's got married recently
I see.
in New Zealand.
Ah,
And so they're having a party.
funny how the ladies acquire different title when they get married.
Do you know who I'm going to see tomorrow?
Buckingham Palace.
No, really guess.
I don't know.
You don't know? Adele.
Oh, I see.
Do you know why I'm going?
No.
She's having a party at her house tomorrow.
It's her birthday, isn't it?
No.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
No.
It's to do with her daughter.
I see.
Do you know why her daughter's having a party?
No.
Guess.
No, I don't.
She's just got married.
Oh, I see.
She just got married in... Do you know what country she just got married in?
No, I don't.
In New Zealand.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
The sentence he is in, he will probably have forgotten the sentence before. You ask him a question, and he'll give you an answer, but while he's giving you the answer, he's already forgotten the question. That's how short it is.
I'm going to see your kids tomorrow.
You see my kids?
Yeah, your children.
What are they up to now?
Do you know what they're up to now?
No.
Guess what you think they're up to.
No idea, I couldn't guess. I don't know what their O-levels were. They haven't got an O-level last time I was conscious. So I didn't know what possible thing they could do, did I?
Nope.
No, I couldn't possibly guess.
Where do you think they are?
No idea. Don't know where I am.
Yep.
All he has is void behind him.
It's been like death. I've never seen a human being before, never had a dream or a thought. The brain has been totally inactive, day and night the same. No thoughts at all. As far as I'm concerned, the doctors have been totally incompetent. I've never seen a doctor the whole time. Oh, look, it's come. Oh, you're wonderful.
That's a very musical kiss. I'm dizzy. I don't know which part of the room I'm standing in.
So you get the idea. Now, many philosophers have said that we need to live in the moment, but you can see truly living in the moment is insanity. It's really only when the present is anchored between the future and the past that it takes on meaning. And time is really a construct of how memory works. In fact, there really is a question if time is nothing more than an epiphenomenon of how we record memory. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the mechanisms behind memory. Starting in the 1920s with Carl Ashley, he taught rats to run through a maze. And once they had learned the maze, then he would resect part of their brains and see which parts of the brains he had to resect before they could no longer run through the maze. And what happened is he found out that he had to resect enormous amounts of brain before he degraded their performance in the maze. And this led him to the notion that somehow memory was a diffuse mass action. It needed a lot of cortical input, and it still functioned with minimal cortical input. The next real insight came along in the 1940s. Charles Duncan was a psychologist, and he put electrodes in the brain, and he would teach the mice to run through the maze. But he realized if every time they ran through the maze he gave them an electric shock, he would wipe out that memory. Now, the interesting thing was he wouldn't just wipe out the memory. He would wipe out a little bit of the memory before that. So it's what we call antegrade amnesia. And so that was the first time that people realized, hey, this memory thing, it's a timed event. If it gets interrupted, it's not just the moment of interruption, it's what came before it. So in the 1960s, Flexner came along and he was working with antibiotics. Amongst them, 2 antibiotics that inhibited protein synthesis, making protein. And he gave these to rats as they were running through the maze. And if he gave them these antibiotics that prohibited protein synthesis, guess what? They couldn't learn how to run through the maze. So here we now had 2 crucial bits of information, actually 3. Diffusely in the cortex. Number 2, it was a timed event that took time for it to evolve. It could be interrupted. And number 3, protein synthesis was critical to whatever the event was. Now we come to one of my favorite characters, Wilder Penfield. One of the reasons I went into neurosurgery was because of the writings of Wilder Penfield. He was educated at Princeton, got a Rhodes Scholarship, was lucky enough to go to Oxford and work under Sir Charles Sherrington, who's probably the greatest neurophysiologist of the 20th century. And then, I'm so jealous, he got to spend a year with Sir William Osler, one of the greatest minds in medicine. And then he came back to McGill to become an epileptic surgeon. He worked on epilepsy, which meant he had to resect parts of the brain where there were these seizures were starting, where these focuses of electric storm were starting. Now, the brain's kind of weird in that it has no pain receptors. Even though it governs the entire network of pain, the brain itself is completely unguarded. It's as if you're inside the temple. And once you've made it inside the temple, there are no guards. So it's a relatively easy thing to anesthetize the scalp and the skull, and then you can open up to the brain, and you can actually talk to an awake patient while you're operating on their brain. And the techniques that were developed by Penfield are the same techniques we still use today, because we need to know if we're resecting a part that has epileptic focus in it, we have to make sure it's not a vital part of the brain, like a speech center. Now, most of Penfield's work was around the temporal lobe. And so he had this opportunity, while patients were awake, he could touch parts of the temporal lobe. So here's a kind of an example of what would happen. He'd touch the temporal lobe in a certain place, and the patient would report, oh, it's my 4th year birthday. I'm 4 years old, and we're setting up the chairs in the yard. And then he'd take the electrode off, and he'd put it back on. He goes, oh, they're bringing the cake out with the candles for me to blow out. Then he'd take the electrode off and put it back on. Oh, we've already had the cake, now we're opening the presents. This was not something anybody anticipated. This was this notion that Penfield was suggesting that there were like loops of movies ongoing in the brain all the time, and that you were accessing them in somehow at random points. Now, to give you some idea of just how accurate this was, one of the patients was a bricklayer. And so they were stimulating his temporal lobe, and he said, oh, I'm working on a building. And in fact, he had worked on a building down in Toronto that was a neo-Gothic reconstruction. They were remodeling the building. He had worked on the building for nearly 9 months, and he was laying 2,000 bricks a day on average. But when they touched him, he said, oh, I'm on the 2nd story. I'm working on the 4th row, 8 bricks from the right. That brick's got a chip. And next, put the electrode back on. 10th row, 3rd brick, and so on. When they went back and actually looked at the bricks, he had remembered every single defect correctly on those bricks. So it's telling us something about memory that we don't completely understand. Now, William James, the father of psychology, said the stream of thought flows on, but most of its segments fall into the bottomless abyss of oblivion. Others, again, leave vestiges which are indestructible and recalled as long as life endures. Now, it's not really the abyss that they fall in, as you heard, it's really the subconscious. We now know from Penfield's experiments and from experiments that are done under hypnosis that there's an incredible amount of material that still remains in the subconscious in very rich detail. Now, we talked this morning about Eric Kendall, and he worked on this delightfully looked creature called the Apolepsia californica, or sea slug. Now, the reason that Kendall went on to win the Nobel Prize is because this creature is so unique. It has a very small brain of about 30,000 ganglion cells, and they're very accurately identifiable from one creature to another. So I can identify the R2 cell from one creature to another. And what he did was remarkable. If you touch the snout, the siphon of this sea slug, it will retract, and it'll suddenly retract the mantle that's over the gills in an act of getting ready to escape, okay? But what he showed, so here's his first experiment. He actually recorded from these individual neurons as this was happening. So down here, what you'll see is you stimulate the siphon, and you get a retraction, a motor retraction, a muscular retraction of the mantle. But if you keep touching the siphon, eventually, just like if I kept tapping your head, you'd eventually stop blinking. Eventually, the creature says, I'm no longer going to react to it. In other words, that creature gets desensitized. And as you can see here, after a while, those motor cells no longer fire. Now, why is that important? Well, what it means is that the actual learning of desensitization is taking place at the cellular level. And we now have the ability to find out what is going on. Now, if I just do that a little bit to a sea slug, it'll remember it for a little bit and then it'll forget. But if I keep doing it to that sea slug, many, 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 many times, that sea slug will stop reacting and it'll remember to stop reacting. And that memory is in its very cells. So, we can ask the question, which he did, what's the short-term memory that gets wiped out? Well, it turns out it's related to a neurotransmitter, that it actually activates increased neurotransmitter release and it changes the voltage in the cell, and eventually it fades away. But if you're looking at permanent memory, it actually changes the number of synapses. A molecule escapes after multiple stimulations, it goes into the nucleus, it transcribes a gene, it creates a new synapse. And so what you see is that long-term memory, long-term memory actually structurally changes the brain. It changes the number of connections in the brain. Now, we talked earlier, and I think it's an important point to go back and look at that memory. Not only can it distort, but it can be distorted. So, how many of you have had an accident, a trauma, where suddenly everything seems to happen in slow motion, like a car accident? Okay. Well, I had a recent trauma about 4 years ago where I had a mare and I suddenly realized that she was getting very defensive, and in the back of my mind, I suddenly said, oh my God, she's going to kick me and break my leg, okay? And I watched her leg coming back, and I said, it's going to break my leg. And it all happened in such slow motion that I could actually count the number of nails in each of her hoofs as her leg came back. So how is it that we distort and slow down time like that? Well, a young man by the name of Dave Eagleman at Baylor got very interested in this and did a series of experiments about what happens to us when time slows down. Now, I'm going to show you, he made a wristwatch, and it flashes at a certain rate. So let me see if I can show you this. So it flashes at a certain rate. Unless you can actually slow time down, you're just going to see the LEDs on this device just flash at you. If you can slow time down, you will actually be able to see numbers appear, but only if you actually can physically slow time down. So you can start to see and then hear the numbers. Okay, so what he needed was a traumatic event, something that would really work. So he went to an amusement park and he got some volunteers, and what he did is he suspended them 150 feet in the air, and then he let them fall backwards into space. And you can imagine this is a small subgroup of quote-unquote normal college students who volunteered for it. So this is what they were going through. And the answer is, time does not slow down. There's no doubt that time does not slow down. What happens is that we appear sort of like a film. If you run it at very high speed, same thing happens with memory. What happens when time is slowing down for you and me is that we are actually making more memories per second than normal. And that is why when we're in these adrenaline-stoked states, we seem to see time slowing down. Now, I have to go into optogenetics for you for a moment. What happens with optogenetics is I can take a gene and insert it into a virus that makes a molecule called chromorhodopsin 2. When I insert that into the brain of a rat, it'll go to certain places and it will cause those cells to light up when they're active. So I not only can see the cells when they're active, but if I actually make that molecule active, I can also activate the cells. So if I put this in the brain and I look, it would sort of be like this. I'm touring a city and I want to know what's going on in that city. So I can look at the office buildings and say, accounting's active, advertising's active, overseas trading is active. Well, here's the hippocampus, and I can actually see the cells that are being activated during learning. So what happens if I take a mouse and I put this mouse in a box, and I teach this mouse that when you're in a certain kind of box, it's a little scary. Okay, so this is the actual paper if you're interested. These guys will definitely, I predict, win the Nobel Prize at some point. So I can label the cells in the hippocampus. I can then put this mouse in a box where the particular box, he says, oh, I get a shock. And every time I'm in that box, I'm going to get scared. And he learns to become fearful of the box. I can then identify what those cells are. I can then put a fiber optic with a laser in it, and I can put him into a new box that he is not scared of. So we put the mouse in a new box, and he wanders around just like mice do. They're curious about their surroundings, and he wanders around exploring the box. But what you're going to see in a moment is as he comes around here, you're going to see some pulses of light. And what that does, right there, you'll see them right there. What those pulses of light do is they activate that area of the brain where the fearful memory was stored. And now the mouse stands stock still, which is what mice do when they're frightened. They just stand completely still. Why is that important? Because it shows how a prior experience will have a profound effect on future experience. The fact is, he has no fearful experience of that box. He's just translated the past fearful experience because these scientists were able to activate that fearful in him. So everything is a copy of a copy with memory. And with this notion of how we ourselves are sort of divided as copies of experience. And we then take experience, we make a memory. From that memory, we make a copy of that memory, and we go on and on and on. Now, Daniel Kahneman's a Nobel Prize-winning economist who got very interested in what's called hedonic psychology, which is the studying why people make the kinds of decisions they do about purchasing and spending their money. And he brought up this concept of the remembering self and the experiencing self. So let me give you an example. You go on vacation and you're at the airport and you're waiting in line and there's a delay and your bags get lost and it takes you 2 days, and finally you get to the beach, you relax, it's wonderful, you come home, and then somebody says to you, so how was your vacation? And you go, great. Okay, because the experience of the vacation is different than what you remember about the vacation. Similarly, you go to a concert. It's a beautiful choral concert of Handel's Messiah. Concert's gorgeous, but in the last minute of the concert, a baby suddenly starts screaming in the row next to you in the orchestra seats, and it just absolutely infuriates you, and eventually there's such a commotion, the mother has to leave, and I ask you, how was the concert? And you go, that baby ruined the concert for me. Well, the baby didn't ruin the experience of the concert because for 39 minutes, the baby wasn't a problem, but the baby ruined the memory of the concert. And that's important because in some ways you can look at life as your experiential self is being dragged around by your remembering self and say, come on, let's have an experience so I can remember it. Okay? And this has a direct bearing on our notions of well-being. So if I ask you, which would you rather be? Would you rather be in an accident and paralyzed and paraplegic or quadriplegic, or would you rather win the lottery? We're not going to have much of a problem. We're going to say I'm going to be much happier winning the lottery. Well, we can look at this dichotomy in well-being between people who are actually rendered paraplegic or quadriplegic and people who won the lottery. And some interesting things come out. So, for example, if you look, it's hard for me to do over here. If you look over here, the quadriplegics and paraplegics rank their past life better than their present life. And the lottery winners rank their past life as worse than their current life. But both groups rank their happiness in the future the same. And when we look at the happiness that they get from mundane daily activities, things like this, things like talking with a friend, laughing, eating breakfast, watching TV, there is no difference in how happy they are day to day. So this notion of subjective well-being and what we're experiencing versus what we remember is very important. Here's another study. It's called the California Dreaming Study. They took people from the Midwest and they asked them and said, how do you think it would be for people who live out in California? Do you think they have better educational opportunities, better lifestyle, better recreation? And they said, oh yeah, everybody in California has it better. And I was looking for this picture of snowblowers, and I have to tell you that Facebook is filled with thousands of pictures of people who love to take pictures snowblowing. I don't know, it's a Facebook thing. But interestingly enough, when you actually query people in California and in the Midwest on these daily activities, there's no difference. They just think people in California have more fun, but they don't. Except for this guy who has more fun than anybody else. So what happens to experience if you don't remember it right? Well, there's an interesting study. If we give something like propofol, what happens is the cortical blood flow goes down and you don't remember. So we call it, let me just go back, we call it milk of amnesia because it has this white color. So a study was done about colonoscopy, where something gets jammed very tight into tight quarters. And again, don't ask me why, but people also post pictures of their colonoscopy on Facebook. Okay. So it turns out that I can ask you, how good was your colonoscopy? Sort of like a TripAdvisor for colonoscopy. And it turns out that people who are experiencing a lot of pain as they come out of the propofol anesthesia give lower ratings to colonoscopy than people who aren't experiencing a lot of pain at the very end. In other words, the very end of how you remember it determines how you're going to rank your colonoscopy. So they had this notion, well, maybe what you should do is just leave the colonoscope in a little bit longer so that if they're a painful period, you leave it in longer until they get to a less painful period, and then you pull it out, and then they're going to give it a higher rating. And that's, in fact, exactly what happens. So now people traditionally wait until they're experiencing less pain before they actually let you emerge from your propofol, so you'll come back in another 10 years and get one more. Now, the remembering self is very important because we are a species of storytellers. And it's not what happened that matters, it's the story of what happened that matters. So this notion of experiential self and the remembering self is very important because the experiential self is asking the question, am I happy in my life? But the remembering self is asking the crucial question, am I happy with my life? And that's a vital difference. So let me talk a little bit about corporations and what can we make some analogies. Well, the 21st century is going to be the first time that we are going to get in the business of applying knowledge back to knowledge, K to K. And knowledge application and knowledge management is going to probably become the primary product in the 21st century. And so corporations are going to have to do very much what the brain does, which is differentiate information from knowledge. So if you think about the brain, what the brain is doing is it's saying over here, hey, listen, I got to have things stable. I have to have things dependable. I got to know where there's a food supply. I got to know that I'm sheltered. But at the same time, the brain says, hey, you know what? A storm's coming. You better make a change. Or game is leaving. You better move. And so the brain has this problem that it's got to remember and try and keep things stable, but at the same time be able to detect when this change is significant and I need to adapt to it. By the same token, corporations have a different assignment. They have to stay profitable and productive, but at the same time, they've got to be able to see what the competition is changing, and they also have to be able to see what innovation they really need to be able to adapt for change. And if you think about them, just do a little math here. The brain has 100 billion neurons, 500 trillion connections. Each neuron 200 times a second, 17.2 trillion potential action potentials per second. So let me give you an idea of just how much information is coming in. We talked about this earlier today. Vision's about 10 million bits. Skin, about 1 million. Ears, 100,000. Smell, 100,000. Taste, 1,000. But the RAM of your brain is only 50 to 60 bytes a second. So you have to compress an enormous amount of data down into what's going to be remembered. And corporations have the same problem. Billions and billions of emails a day, 4.3 billion email clients per day, 61% of the email traffic from those clients is non-essential. You have to be able to boil the knowledge down. So this is the beautiful library at Trinity College in Dublin. This is information. But until this reads this, it doesn't turn into knowledge. Now, Ikejiro Nonaka was a Japanese economist and businessman. He was born in the 1930s, so he grew up during the defeat of Japanese forces during World War II. And he went on, got his MBA and PhD at Stanford, and he wrote, his first book he ever wrote was The Essence of Failure, an organizational study of the Japanese armed forces during World War II. But he went on and got interested in how did the Japanese use the knowledge that they had and apply that knowledge. And then he went into business and looked at this business of knowledge management. And in some ways, they're comparable. You know, the brain has all of these massive numbers of incoming signals, but when I see this pattern of reflected light, I say, oh, I recognize that, that's a Van Gogh. And in a corporation, you have all this explicit knowledge. Anything you can write in a number, in words, in data, that's explicit knowledge. But tacit knowledge is very hard to describe because it's personalized. It's hard to formulate. It's hard to communicate. So let me give you an example of what Nonaka was talking about. So let's say you're a good race car driver. Okay, so that would be tacit knowledge. I can't tell you what it takes to be. I might be able to coach another driver. I might be able to work with them. But I can't take anybody and just say I'm going to make them into a good race car driver. Now, that race car driver could take that tacit knowledge and say, hey, you know what you need? You need a better airfoil to give me more traction on my tires. So that's turning tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge. I can codify that explicit knowledge and turn it into information that I can then pass along. Hey, when you get this airfoil, you'll get this traction and this output from the motor. Then, once I have that explicit information, I still have to go back to that race car driver and say, tell me, how's she handling? So I go back into this tacit knowledge. And in a lot of ways, you're going from a very personal process of tacit knowledge to a very communicative, dispersive process of explicit knowledge. So there really is a pretty similar progression from neuron to synapse to circuits to white matter tracts and to lobes of the brain to the brain itself. And the same way you can go through a corporation, through individuals, teams, subgroups, organizations, all the way up to a corporation. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, finally, dementia. This is Alzheimer's. You can see the diminished blood flow here in this Alzheimer's patient. If you look, what's happening in Alzheimer's is there are these neurofibrillary tangles. These neurons die. The brain actually loses substance, and the individual goes on to become demented. So this is a very interesting series of paintings done by an artist named William Ultermo. He was an American artist, but he worked in the UK primarily. And in 1995, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And his wife very lovingly kept his paintings. And I just want you to look, because it's very hard to translate what Alzheimer means, but I do think these paintings put it into perspective. So this is his painting back in 1967. This is his painting 1 year after he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, 2 years after Alzheimer's, 3 years after Alzheimer's, 4 years after Alzheimer's. In his last year, this was his self-portrait, and this was the last portrait he ever made of himself. And it's telling that it's black and white, and what he told his wife is, that when he looked in the mirror, he no longer even recognized himself. So there's this stripping away of what your true identity is. And corporations can suffer dementia too. If we look at Kodak, if you look at once upon a time, Kodak was, in terms of market value, was number 2. And then it dropped down to, I think it was number 7. And by the 1992, 20 years later, it's 87th. And what happened to Kodak? Well, Kodak sales plummeted. Their sales of film fell off dramatically. Here was when they started up with digital cameras. You can see it never caught on. These purple bars are cell phones. So these are digital cameras and cell phones. And you can see that as this caught on, their sales of film products, and they never could catch up in the digital market. And eventually they sold less and less film. Their stock plummeted. And on January 2012, after 128 years of business, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. So how did that happen? Well, it happened because they developed amnesia. They became demented. They forgot that they were in the photography business. They forgot why they had gotten into the film business. I mean, they had started with Eastman making cameras that were available for commercial production. The whole point about making these film was to allow people to buy more cameras and use more cameras and take more photographs. And then the Japanese came out with a digital camera. Now, what happened to Kodak? Well, they said, we're going to continue making film. That's our primary business. Now, what was really sad was actually Kodak had made the first digital camera in history in 1975. And the reason that they didn't want to produce it is they said, we don't want to hurt our photography sales, our film sales. They forgot they were in the business of photography. The cameras was the name of the game. The capturing images was the name of the game. So let me just finish up and say, look, first, memory creates content and context for the present. It appears to be diffusely stored. It can be disruptive. It creates change. Change creates memory, but memory creates change. Memory can be distorted, and it can distort. What we remember is far more important in making decisions than what we experience. We are literally made from memories, and we make use of memory through practice, processing, and preserving those memories by accessing them. Let me just finish that information is not memory, memory is not experience, experience is not knowledge, and knowledge is not wisdom. But wisdom is information that's derived from experience so that it can be processed into knowledge and put into action. So I'm going to finish with this. I came across this. And the Dalai Lama, when asked what surprised him most about humanity, answered man. Because he sacrifices his health in order to make money. Then he sacrifices money to recuperate his health. And then he's so anxious about the future, he doesn't enjoy the present. The result being that he does not live in the present or the future. He lives as if he's never going to die, and then he dies having never really lived. So I'll finish with this last one. How do we lose our way in life? Because we forget. And how do we remedy that? By remembering. Remembering is attending to the substance of life. It's pertaining to what actually goes into making us human beings. And it also pertains just as much to what is going on in the life of corporations and the lives of the people in those corporations. It is the most important thing that we do, applying knowledge to knowledge. Thank you.